How's it going, everybody? I'm the Fizz. If you were clicking on this video because you saw like Metroid discussion, then one thing to get out of the way real quick is I'm mostly known for my Sonic stuff. I'm more of a Sonic the Hedgehog guy. But if you are showing up and watching this video because maybe I've shared on my Discord or you just watch some of my content, one other thing to know about me is I'm a huge Metroid fan too. Like I absolutely love Metroid. It's not just Sonic all the time to me. Like, Metroid is in my top 5 favorite franchises. There's like Sonic, there's Zelda, and then like Mario and Metroid are like tied for 3rd and 4th. Like, those are Metroids in my top 5. I love the Metroid franchise. It's one of my favorite franchises of all time. I feel like it's probably one of the most underrated, top quality franchises that Nintendo has, like, of all time ever. But the reason I wanted to make this video is because I wanted to discuss a little bit about Metroid Dread. Now, a couple years ago, we got a teaser for Metroid Prime 4, and we've not heard anything about it since. Like, Metroid Prime 4 has not been talked about at all by Nintendo. Like, they announced it, and they've left us to basically stew on that for a while. If I had to guess, we will probably not be hearing anything about Metroid Prime 4 until either like late this year or maybe next year. Like, if we don't get to it late this year, I can definitely see Metroid Prime news being a thing for next E3. But obviously, I hope it's sooner than that. Like, I really do hope that we get more Metroid Prime 4 news. But enough about Metroid Prime 4. The reason why we were talking about it at all is because we were all expecting Metroid Prime 4 news today, or the day of the E3 Nintendo Direct, and we didn't get Metroid Prime 4 news. Instead, we got something that I think is probably better. We've got a new entry into the 2D Metroid series. I mean, if you're not super familiar with Metroid, like if you're one of the people in the Infinity Plus server or something coming and watching this video, and you're not super interested in or familiar with Metroid, Metroid has essentially 2 different branches in its franchise. There is the mainline Metroid, and then there is Metroid Prime. Metroid Prime is a first-person exploration shooter franchise that, or not franchise, branch that started in the GameCube era and is persisting until up to Metroid Prime 4 on the Switch. There was Metroid Prime 1, Metroid Prime 2 Echoes, Metroid Prime 3 Corruption, and then they were all compacted and remastered and re-released on the Wii for the Metroid Prime trilogy, which I really hope they re-release that for Switch, but that may not happen, who knows. But then there's the main Metroid franchise, or the main branch of the Metroid games. There is Metroid 1, Metroid 2 Return of Samus, Super Metroid, and then Metroid Fusion. So those are the 4 primary Metroid games. There are also a couple of other Metroid games as well. There's Metroid Other M, there's Metroid Prime Federation Force, and then there's also Metroid Prime Hunters as well. If I'm remembering off the top of my head, I believe that's all of the Metroid games, like in terms of actual main titles. But in terms of like the main sequence of like mainline titles, we've not gotten one in 19 years. Like, back in 2002 was whenever Metroid Fusion released for the Game Boy Advance. That was the last mainline Metroid title we had gotten. And we are finally getting 5. Like, Metroid Fusion is Metroid 4. We are finally getting Metroid 5 after 19 years. Like, this is amazing. Like, I absolutely love Metroid. It's, like I said, in my top 5 favorite franchises, so to finally see a new 2D Metroid game, I mean, obviously I was excited for Metroid Prime 4 too. Like, don't get me wrong. I'm not as into Metroid Prime as I am the mainline Metroid titles, but I was excited for Metroid Prime 4 just because I wanted to see where Metroid Prime would go after the Corruption arc, or if Metroid Prime 4 is just going to continue the Corruption arc, which I don't see that happening, but we'll see in the future when it finally releases, or we get more information from it, But I mainly wanted to go over Metroid 5, or Metroid Dread as it's known, because I feel like, and this is more so me communicating with other Metroid fans, as well as anyone who's just interested in Metroid now that, people are making a big deal of Metroid now that it's coming back. I feel like there has to be a small amount of discussion here involving Metroid. Metroid, like I said, has got to be one of the highest ranking franchises Nintendo owns in terms of sheer quality. Like, every single Metroid game, barring like one or two titles, have been crafted to near perfection on the hardware that they were created on. Like, obviously there have been some things that could have been better with each individual title that have been released, but pretty much for the most part, anytime you try and look for things wrong with certain Metroid titles, and I'm talking about the original release here, not like remakes like Return of Samus or anything. If you look at the original games, there are certain things that can be made to improve them, but for the most part, they were already pretty much pushing the limits of the console they were on. Like Metroid 1, even though Metroid 1 nowadays is seen as a relatively blech game, it did technically push the capabilities of the NES. Same thing with Metroid 2 Return of Samus on the Game Boy. There are definitely things that could have been better, that could have improved that game, but it's still considered a top tier Game Boy game. Super Metroid. I don't have to talk about Super Metroid. Everyone knows about Super Metroid. It's considered one of the best video games of all time. Metroid Fusion. I know there's a lot of like hardcore Metroid fans that kind of shit on Fusion, but honestly, Fusion to me is one of the best Metroid games ever. Like, it's just a beautifully crafted game. Similarly to Super Metroid, in terms of like the goal that it set out to do, I feel like it achieved it perfectly, similarly to how Super Metroid set out to accomplish a goal, and it did that. So, even though they're not really comparable in terms of the two games, I feel like they both achieved what they wanted to, and did so in such a well-crafted manner that it made those games perfect in their own right. And obviously, I'm using perfect in a very loose term here. The same can be sort of applied to the Prime series as well. Metroid Prime 1, 2, and 3. Each one kind of had their own thing that they was going for, and they kind of, they kind of achieved it sort of in some way or fashion, form or fashion. Minor disclaimer, I've not actually beaten Metroid Prime 1 or 2 Echoes. I've only beaten Metroid Prime 3 Corruption. Prime 3 Corruption is the only Metroid game I've actually completed. Metroid Prime game. I am wanting to rectify that, though. I'm planning on streaming my playthroughs through Metroid Prime 1 and Metroid Prime 2 Echoes, because those are games that I would like to play. Unfortunately, I really do hate to admit this, I am playing them on an emulator, because they have not re-released the trilogy, or they're not bringing the trilogy back, as far as I'm concerned, to the Switch, and buying physical copies is insanely expensive, and even then, I don't have a way of capturing off of the Wii that I own, so I don't really have an option in terms of it, but I really do want to replay those games, and honestly, I have at least played them. Like, I have touched them and picked them up and played them, because I did use it on the Prime Trilogy back in the day, but the main reason I'm saying that is because I don't have a full personal, scale of Metroid Prime 1 and 2. I do have a full scale of Metroid Prime 3. I have played through it. I do absolutely love that game, but from what I've heard from a lot of other people who have played Metroid Prime 1 and Metroid Prime 2, that like those games they set out to achieve something, and they did so in their own unique way, and that can obviously be applied to the other Metroid games as well. But the reason I bring this up is because it's clear to me, I don't know if anyone else has noticed this. If they have, I have not heard of it, mostly because I don't interact with the Metroid community very much. Like, I really don't, mostly because I don't really enjoy doing it. But one thing that I have noticed, at least myself, is based on everything that we have in terms of information for Metroid Dread, Metroid might be veering away a little bit into a slightly different direction than what we're used to, like as Metroid fans. And honestly, personally to me, it's for the better. If we want more Metroid games, more people are gonna have to buy Metroid games. It's unfortunate. Like, I'm not one of those people who are like, oh, just consume. Like, I hate being, a consumer kind of person. But the unfortunate reality in our world is if we want a video game company to continue making games in a franchise, we have to buy those games. Like, we can't pirate them. We can't go, oh, there's like a couple of nitpicky things I have against this game, so I'm not going to support the developers because it's not fine-tuned exactly how I want it. If we want them to continue this, we have to actually give them money, because they're not going to listen to what we want. They're going to listen to what we'll pay for, unfortunately. Like, there's just an unfortunate reality we live in. And because of that, I believe Nintendo is trying to make Metroid slightly more consumer friendly. Because if there's one thing that most Metroid fans can probably agree upon, is the fact that Metroid, in terms of, like, in comparison to other Nintendo games, like other big hitting Nintendo games like, Donkey Kong, Kirby, Mario, Zelda, Metroid's difficult. Like, Metroid games are not easy. Obviously, Metroid 1 was difficult, Metroid 2 were difficult because of the hardware they were on. That's just how games were back then. They were insanely difficult. We were still getting our feet wet with, in terms of game design, Metroid was a very genre-breaking and defining game. So things were rough back then. That's understandable. But Super Metroid, I would argue, and even especially Metroid Fusion, are not very beginner-friendly games. Like, they're not like insanely difficult to the point where you just can't beat them, but they're not super easy either. For example, I played Metroid 1. I believe Metroid 1 on the NES was my first Metroid game, because I grew up with NES, SNES, and Sega Genesis growing up. My dad had a whole bunch of old NES games, so that's where I played Mario 2, Mario 3, Zelda 2, Kid Icarus, Metroid. Like, I've played all of those games ever since I was really young. But outside of Metroid 1, my very first Metroid game was Fusion, which a lot of people, like, if you're familiar with Metroid games, or if you've ever talked to Metroid fans, they'll tell you that Fusion is not easy. Like, it's not an easy game. I didn't end up playing Super Metroid until I think I was like 15 or so, or like 15, 16 or so. I played it on the, I must have been a little bit older than that. I played it on the Wii U eShop. Like, I bought it on the Wii U, and I played it on the virtual console emulator there. That was the first time I played it, and I did play it all the way through, and I beat it at, like, in my teens, but it was not necessarily the easiest game to go through. Obviously, if you grew up with those games, they were probably a little bit easier, because how Super Metroid as a game is structured, that's kind of how you expected games to play back then, back in the Super Nintendo era. Games generally played with certain structures in mind back then, so if you grew up back then and played those games of that era, I would argue it was probably easier on you, because your frame of reference on how video games function was different than how video games function now. So what I would argue is a lot of people nowadays probably would find Super Metroid and Metroid Fusion really difficult games. And because of that, it is probably difficult to argue with Nintendo on re-releasing them. Therefore, it is a lot harder to get people to buy Metroid games, because they're not re-releasing them, they're not going to buy them. Therefore, Nintendo doesn't see Metroid as a profitable franchise. It's kind of in constant, terrible, negative feedback loop in a way. So by making Metroid Dread easier, not necessarily easier, I'm not trying to say like it's going to be an easy game. it's clearly not going to be super easy. But by taking certain mechanics of Metroid's past and streamlining them to make the overall experience a lot smoother, I feel like it's going to make Metroid Dread more accessible to newer fans, people who are being brought in because of the hype that we older fans are generating. Because I'm not gonna lie, anytime someone who is unfamiliar with Metroid, at least people that I've interacted with, like anytime I've interacted with anyone who's not familiar with Metroid and they look at a trailer or they like see gameplay, they're just not interested. They're like, oh, it's Metroid. Okay. Like, there's not really anything about Metroid that other game franchises haven't already done. Metroid, even though it's one of the oldest sci-fi video game franchises around, it's not kept up with the times very well. Like, why would they play Metroid when they can play Halo? Or, I know Doom's not really sci-fi, but it's got certain sci-fi sex, or like, you know, Doom, or God forbid Cyberpunk or something like that. You know, why would people play these other futuristic sci-fi games, like, or Alien Isolation, for example, whenever, like, why would anyone play Metroid when they can play those games? So the only people generating hype for this really are us, like us existing fans. We're the only ones talking about it. We're the only ones sharing it and spreading it around. And I feel like an important topic of discussion here is that whenever we go into Metroid Dread, we have to be a little bit more open-minded about it than we have in previous Metroid games. Like, a lot more open-minded. I mentioned earlier that I don't enjoy talking with the Metroid community, and by the way, as a frame of reference, this is coming from someone who interacts with the Sonic community on a daily basis. Interacting with the Metroid community is probably one of the worst experiences I've had. Like, it's not fun talking with other Metroid fans a lot, because similarly to Sonic fans, Metroid fans often in the Metroid community are super divided and divisive, I think is the word I was looking for, about how Metroid should be structured. And obviously, being a Sonic fan, I understand those arguments. Sonic fans have those arguments all the time about how Sonic games are structured. But I feel like how Metroid games were structured in the past are not super friendly to how games nowadays are made, meaning that Metroid games of the past are not very marketable to gamers of today. And I'm talking about more casual gamers. Nintendo has always been a company who, as of recently, especially ever since the Wii era, they have always tried to cater to the casual gamers. The Nintendo Switch is obviously a console similarly to the Wii, where anyone can buy it thanks to its versatility, and they can find some form of function out of it, and they can also, they can buy all different kinds of games that they can buy their Just Dances, or maybe they might on occasion get interested in golf and they might play, or get a Mario Golf Open Tour or something like that, It's very clear that that's the direction that Nintendo has kind of always went with in pushing things, and it's very clear that Metroid is going in that direction as well. And like I said, we as the Metroid fans need to be a little bit more accepting of that. And if anyone's confused as to what I'm talking about, I'm sure Metroid fans are not confused at all. Whenever it comes, I brought these two games up in the past, and I compared them for a specific reason. Metroid fans are very decisive about how games have to be structured, and I don't know if Metroid Dread is going to follow suit in that. But the two games I'm going to bring up as an example would be Super Metroid and Metroid Fusion. The reason I bring those games up is because they have a very different design philosophy in terms of how the player progresses. Metroid Fusion is very much a more linear experience. Like, the story is laid out in a more linear fashion. You go from point A to point B to point C to point D, on and on and on, up all the way into the end of the game. Versus Super Metroid, which follows a less linear path where you're allowed to kind of explore, find the areas for yourselves, explore what the world has to offer, and experiment with your abilities and stuff like that. Metroid Fusion did have some exploration and some experimentation as well, but definitely not to the same degree that Super Metroid did, obviously. But again, I'm not going to get into the semantics because Metroid Fusion was very clearly going for something new. But the reason I brought this whole situation up is because Super Metroid is hailed as one of the best video games of all time. And Metroid Fusion, being the direct follow-up to that, had a lot to live up to. There is a lot of things that people who loved Super Metroid expected Metroid Fusion to check off the list. And Metroid Fusion did not check a lot of those things off the list, like it just did. Metroid Fusion went a different direction, and because of that, Metroid Fusion, in my opinion, has probably been one of the most overlooked and ignored Metroid games to date. Not including, obviously, Other M. People often try to forget Other M or Federation Force even exists, but not including those two outliers of the main titles, I would argue Fusion is probably the one game that a lot of people like to pretend doesn't exist of the main titles because it didn't follow suit with what people expected of Super Metroid, despite the fact that Metroid Fusion is a well-crafted experience of a game that you can enjoy that is simply different from Super Metroid. I feel like this is just in gaming in general. I'm not trying to, single out any individual, fandom whenever I say this, but I feel like there are a lot of times whenever companies feel like they cannot experiment and evolve on things without the entire fan base just shitting on them. Like, they're not allowed to evolve and change things and do something new without the fan base going, no, this isn't how the previous game was. The previous game was near perfection. You should have just did that again, I feel like a lot of companies are boxed in because of that, because people are afraid of change. They're afraid of something new. And there's some people that aren't necessarily afraid, but they just hate change. They just hate anything new. And I feel like that's kind of what happened between Super Metroid and Metroid Fusion, is Metroid Fusion was change. It was something new. It was something different. It was not what everyone wanted it to be, because everyone wanted it to be Super Metroid, and because of that, Metroid Fusion just kind of fell to the side despite it being an actually good game. And I'm not saying if you don't like Metroid Fusion that you're a terrible person or anything. You're not obligated to like Metroid Fusion, obviously. I'm not here to shit on you, but I am here to say that whenever we go to Metroid Dread, I hope you're not expecting Super Metroid 2. Like, based on all of the footage I've been seeing and based on the information that we've been drip fed just throughout today, I really hope you're not expecting Super Metroid 2, because I don't think you're gonna get it. And if you're going to bitch and moan, and I'm not gonna say boycott, because I feel like that'd be too much of an extreme. I feel like Metroid fans are too starved to boycott any Metroid content at this point. But if you're gonna complain and say, oh, don't buy Dread because it does XYZ things differently from Super Metroid or some other Metroid game or something like that, you're not going to do this franchise any favors. Metroid is gonna get buried into the dirt for another 20 fucking years. Now, obviously, I'm not saying don't criticize. That would be stupid. Obviously, if there are legitimate, whenever the game releases, and we play through it and we find legitimate game mechanic issues, like things don't flow well, there's a lot of issues with how things progress, there's just, the difficulty's too hard, or there's a whole bunch of game breaking glitches, or whatever. If there's actual legitimate critiques of the game's structure and mechanics itself, go at it. Everyone's obligated to do so. I would never tell you to not criticize something, because at the end of the day, as long as you're doing it with the intent to try and make the franchise better, who cares? Complain all you want. But if you're gonna sit here and go, oh, don't get this because you could just play Super Metroid and have a better experience. If you just keep doing that, we're never going to have another Metroid. It's not going to happen. We're not going to get any more Metroids. If you keep doing that and you keep saying, hey, don't buy this game, Nintendo is going to look at their sales and they're going to go, oh, nobody bought this game. I guess nobody likes Metroid. Okay, we're not going to make any more Metroids. And don't say that I'm being over exaggerated here. Nintendo has already done this. They've done this with so many other franchises. Star Fox hasn't sold very well. They've not hardly made any Star Fox game. Don't even begin to talk about F-Zero. You mentioned F-Zero and, someone's bound to be like, oh, we've not got a new F-Zero in so many years. I don't actually know when the last F-Zero game was, I feel bad for F-Zero fans. I don't care for the franchise, but I honestly feel bad for F-Zero fans, and I feel bad for a lot of fans of different Nintendo franchises out there, because the moment something starts to appear slightly unprofitable, Nintendo drops it. And then they leave it alone for like 15 to 25 years. And then they bring it back with some interesting idea to probably bank on nostalgia. And then if it's successful, they'll continue it. But other than that, if it's not successful and it just doesn't sell very well again, they're just going to drop it. And they're going to basically blue ball a bunch of fans. Like, oh, we finally got a new F-Zero after 30 years, but it didn't sell well, so we're just not going to get another F-Zero. Like, I guarantee you that will happen. Now, obviously, I'm not going to say, go and just buy the game as much as possible. But try to be... I keep punching my mic. Try to be more open-minded about it. Like, just go... This game is not like other Metroid games. Let's be open-minded about it and say, hey, I hear you're going into, you're wanting to try Metroid Dread. I've played Metroid Dread. It's not like other Metroid games, so if you want to get into the franchise, just know that it's not like these other games. You might have a better experience with these other games, but I still encourage you to at least try Dread and see for yourself. Because there are so many different Metroid fans, similar to like Sonic fans or Zelda fans or Mario fans. Like, there are so many different fans that like so many different things that it's impossible to say like, oh, this is better, so just play this instead, whenever you don't know that person's preferences. Like, even though I absolutely had an amazing time with Super Metroid, I kind of like Fusion better. Like, I enjoy Fusion more every time I go back and play Fusion. But that's my personal preference. I don't necessarily think Fusion is a better game, but I'll replay Fusion any day versus Super Metroid. And that's the same thing with other people. Like, they're gonna go, oh, you suggest playing Super Metroid, but I really enjoyed this game so far, so I'm going to keep playing it, and if I am still interested in Metroid after I finish it, then I'll go try Super Metroid, and then I will get back to you on how I feel about it. Like, it's obviously the idea of promoting a more positive community, and I'm not sitting here trying to say, like, oh, the community has to be more positive or anything, but if we don't act welcoming to people in a relatively, I'm not saying it's an empty franchise because there's a lot of fans in it, but a relatively quiet franchise in comparison to other Nintendo franchises, like, no one's going to want to stay. And if no one stays, then no one's going to stick around to buy other games, meaning the franchise is just going to die off again. So obviously, I'm not saying buy as many as you can. I'm not saying, try to inflate the sales or anything like that. I'm just saying, let's keep things with an open mind. Like, let's just go into this with a little bit more of an open mind, because I don't want to throw around the word elitist, but there are a lot of Metroid fans that I've met that are super stuck in the past with how games have to function to them. And I know that doesn't apply to everyone. There are, like, I guarantee that if say 100 Metroid fans watch this video, probably 75 of them would have no idea what the hell I'm talking about. Like, there's probably like 75 of those 100 people being like, oh no, I've tried Metroid Prime and Metroid Prime 3 Corruption and Super Metroid and Fusion, and I loved all those games. Like, if that's the case, obviously this doesn't apply to you, because, like, as long as we are promoting a positive community and we are promoting the fact that this franchise is worth people's time and investment, then that's fine. But there are a lot of people I feel like we need to bring attention to that say, it's not Super Metroid, it's shit, don't buy it, you know. We just try to keep a little bit more of an open mind. Like, if you don't like the game, that's fine. If Metroid 5 comes out, Metroid Dread comes out, and you don't like it, okay, that's fine. You are entitled to your opinion. I have absolutely no interest in trying to change that. I don't care if you like it or don't like it. It's up to you. But don't, unless you legitimately believe that purchasing Metroid Dread would be a poor financial decision for someone, don't be sitting here going like, oh, whatever you do, avoid Metroid Dread at all times, you know, because you're not doing anything to help this community. You're just going to be like, at that point in time, you're actively putting roadblocks for this community to advance anywhere. Like, look at Nintendo. I'm sorry, Nintendo. Look at Mario. Look at Pokemon. Look at Zelda. These are 3 of the largest IPs that Nintendo owns. These 3 franchises bank with everything they touch. Like, Zelda could release a toilet cover and it would sell. Pokemon could sell adult toys and it would sell. Like, these IPs alone with brand recognition sell things. I don't think Metroid will ever get to that point. I honestly don't. I'm thinking realistically here. But it would be interesting to see Metroid come to a light that is a lot more open than it has been in the past. Like, people can look at Metroid like they look at Kirby. Like, I would argue that Kirby is a relatively popular franchise for Nintendo. Everyone looks at the puffball, they know exactly who that is. They go, oh, that's Kirby. He's made by the same guy who makes Super Smash Brothers. Everyone likes Super Smash Brothers. Kirby's cute, he's squishy and adorable, you know. The same thing with Donkey Kong. Everyone knows who Donkey Kong is. They look at Donkey Kong, they're like, oh, he was originally in Donkey Kong. That's where Mario started off. Or he was in Donkey Kong Tropical Freeze or Donkey Kong Country Returns or something like that, you know. I don't think Metroid is there yet. Metroid, personally to me, from my subjective and, you know, very biased popularity gauge that I've seen in recent years, Metroid kind of hovers somewhere between, like, Donkey Kong Kirby up here and Kid Icarus down here. I feel really bad for Kid Icarus because it's super cool and fun, but it's probably one of the more least recognized, you know, Metroid franchises. To me, Nintendo franchises, Metroid sits somewhere in between there, in between like Donkey Kong and Kid Icarus. Metroid's kind of in that gray area where they have released quite a few games for it. You can, if you only count mainline titles, you can literally count the number of mainline titles on both hands. Almost all of them have received critical praise to some extent, but not a lot of them sold insanely well. I think Super Metroid and Metroid Prime are, I believe, whenever I edit this, I'll check the numbers, but I believe Metroid Prime and Super Metroid are like the best-selling games in the franchise, but I could be mistaken on that one. Metroid's not quite there yet. I believe we could get Metroid up to Donkey Kong and Kirby level. Like, it could become as recognizable as Kirby and as Donkey Kong. I don't see Metroid ever becoming the next Zelda, you know? I don't see anything ever overtaking Pokemon and Mario. Like, Pokemon and Mario are so just immediately recognizable by literally anyone. Like, you could show a picture of Mickey Mouse and Super Mario and people would be able to point both of them out. Like, I don't think you could do the same thing if you showed a picture of Goofy or, like, you know, Aladdin and then showed a picture of Samus. No one would know who the fuck Samus is. Like, the casual public, no one knows who Metroid is, and I don't think it's ever going to be that way. I don't think anyone will be able to recognize Samus on that level. But we can get close. We could get close. But the thing is, we have to actually support Metroid. We have to be open in discussion with Metroid, because Metroid is such a cool franchise. I'm a huge fan of the games. If you're watching this, you're probably a huge fan of the games. We both love Metroid. Like, that's why we're here. That's why we're talking about Metroid Dread here. Like, we love it. We want to see the franchise grow and evolve. But we can't do that if we're gonna suck Super Metroid's dick all the time. I know I keep harping on Super Metroid. I do like that game, and I'm not trying to sit here and say anyone who likes Super Metroid is stupid or anything, because that would be insanely rude. It would also be wrong, for one. Like, more importantly, it'd be a terrible sweeping generalization situation. But I do think that some people have to be a little bit more open to the idea that things are changing with Metroid. And I've been talking for like 35 minutes. I meant to actually talk about why I think it's changing based on all the evidence that I've seen, and I think I'm going to go over that next real quick. Why I believe that Metroid Dread is changing things based on our evidence. So first and foremost, this is obviously made directly from the engine that made Metroid Samus Returns. Like, it has the same, based on footage from what we can see, it has pretty much the same movement mechanics. You can, like, climb on walls, you can not climb on walls, you can ledge grab, you can jump off ledges, the way that you wall jump, all of it looks insanely smooth. I mean, like, Metroid Fusion and Metroid Zero Mission and Metroid Samus Returns, like, this buttery smooth movement. That, obviously, that's not really a thing that they're changing to make things more accessible. That's just something they're doing to evolve the platforming mechanics of Metroid. But obviously, because it's built off of the engine made that Metroid Samus Returns was made on, it comes with some of the additional mechanics as well, such as the counter, and they have as well as the 360 degree aiming. Those are both really, really interesting ideas that was brought in Samus Returns and has been further evolved in this version, which I'm super glad to see. I'm not familiar with the majority or the general consensus on people's opinions on Samus Returns. I loved it. I thought it was a really great Metroid experience. I enjoyed it quite a bit, but I don't know what the fan base's general consensus on that game is. But personally, to me, I enjoyed it, so I am really, really, really glad to see that some of the mechanics are coming back. And not only are they coming back, they're being improved. So the ability to dash counter, as well as, like, immediately attack afterward, and the 360 aiming can also be done while moving instead of, like, just standing still. I think you could do that while moving in Samus Returns. I don't remember off the top of my head, but I do know that I'm pretty sure you did have to stand still to do it. But seeing that be a main thing that you can do while moving is honestly really, really interesting, and does make the flow of combat a little bit smoother, in my opinion. Obviously based on just footage alone. I've not played the game, so I can't say that for a fact. But based on footage alone, to me, that looks like it will make gameplay feel a little bit more smoother. The other thing that was also included was the slide mechanic. To me, I think the slide mechanic is really interesting and cool, because combat in Metroid games have always been kind of clunky a little bit, even back in Super Metroid, back in Metroid Fusion. I always thought it was really kind of clunky because essentially all you had to do in order to avoid an enemy was one of two things. You either killed the enemy before it killed you, or you jumped over it. Unless you had the screw attack or something like that, or power bombs, which you didn't get until a later game. But in terms of, like, the first 3/4 of a game, if you had to avoid combat with an enemy, you jumped over it. And jumping was not always ideal because you dealt with both grounded enemies as well as flying enemies, or enemies hanging above you, or enemies on a wall nearby, or enemies shooting projectiles at you. So jumping was not always ideal. So to me, a slide mechanic that allows you to slide underneath grounded enemies or below, like, flying enemies that are flying roughly at, like, face level, to me, that is a brilliant mechanic for slipping around enemies in terms of combat. Gives you a little bit more freedom in terms of how you utilize the battlefield. That is very interesting and unique to me. Well, not really unique, but very interesting and seems very fun to me. That to me sounds like a more of a smoothing mechanic, like a quality of life improvement, if you will, on the traditional Metroid combat. Obviously, there is the counter move, which if you played Samus Returns, you're very familiar with that. There's also the fact that you can do like a dash counter. I wasn't entirely sure how that functioned. They kind of just mentioned it in passing, but it seemed pretty interesting. I think it's just a counter you can do while moving, I believe. So very much that situation of keeping the flow of gameplay, like keep things moving. And not only that, but to also even further instigate that design philosophy is the level design from what I've seen. Like every time I see footage of the Nintendo employees playing it for trailers or whatever, Samus is always moving. She's always doing something because the level design allows for it. She's always jumping on platforms. She's always crawling on something. She's always sliding under something. Even if she's not moving from room to room, even in one singular room, she is doing all these acrobatic things, which if you've played Metroid Fusion, you would know that that's how a lot of the level design Metroid Fusion is done. The same thing in Super Metroid as well. It was done that way in Super Metroid as well, but Fusion and Zero Mission had it in a lot more of a compact way. And I feel like that Dread is probably taking a few more notes from Fusion and Zero Mission than they are from Super Metroid in this instance. Basically because all of the level design from what I've seen so far seems to be very compact and kind of small in comparison to Super Metroid, which is a little bit more open. So with all of that combined, it does make for very interesting basic gameplay. Another note on the slide thing, it does actually, to me, that's another quality improvement. I actually really like the slide mechanic. I think it's cool because it prevents you from having to come to a stop or having to do a mid-air morph ball drop or whatever to retain speed whenever sliding into just, basic crouch holes or whatever they're called. I don't know what you would call them. Like little spaces. Generally in Metroid games, you would either walk up to it and crouch into a ball and then roll over, which generally took time to stop. And you could get around the amount of time it took to stop. Like you didn't have to stop and then crouch into a ball and roll. You could do a mid-air morph ball, which if you did so, did retain some speed. But in most Metroid games, jumping generally gave you some type of horizontal momentum nerf. There was generally, unless you were doing a speed boost jump, jumping while moving generally slowed you down in some way. So that and the act of crouching in midair and going into a morph ball also negated all speed as well. So even though there were ways around stopping, coming to a mid stop and going to a morph ball and rolling into sections, like it was never super smooth, and the only way to get around it, or not really get around it, but just mitigate the flow disruption, was a little bit more mechanically demanding. So to me, a mechanic like this that allows you to just slip under little holes in the wall that allows you to just move from one section to another, to me that's genius. Like just do a little slide, Another thing to me that is a major improvement is the spider climb. Like to me that's another major quality of life improvement over the spider ball. If anyone who is not familiar with Metroid, like if you're watching this wondering what the hell I'm talking about, the spider ball was a move introduced in Metroid 2. It was obviously used in Metroid Return of Samus, and then, the remake of Metroid 2. Samus Returns, Return of Samus, I always forget which one it is. Essentially, it was never brought up again in 2D Metroid. It was brought in in the Prime games. I know it was in Corruption. I believe it was in Echoes. I don't remember if it was in Prime 1 or not because I didn't get that far into Prime 1. But it was a mechanic that showed up once in the 2D games and then never again, except for the remake of said game. But obviously the major problem with the spider ball is it's a mechanic that only allows you to use ball abilities, morph ball abilities, which is essentially bomb or power bomb, because you couldn't, if you were playing Metroid Prime 3 Corruption, there was also the speed ball, but you couldn't do that while in a spider climb. Actually, you could. You would just hop. It would act as kind of like a little wall jump mechanic. But to me, bringing that out of the morph ball and making that something that Samus can just do based on specific surfaces, to me is a lot smarter, because it allows you to still include spider ball mechanics or spider ball level design into your levels, but it also allows the player to shoot at things. It allows the player to use their different beams or their different missiles and stuff like that. And if they do jump off of the wall, they will already be more than likely in a spinning jump motion. So you could go from a spider climb into a screw attack or something like that, you know. Versus with the spider ball, you would have to uncurl in midair and then hold forward, tap the jump to go into a somersault. So to me, that is a much more streamlined solution to the spider ball situation that makes it personally to be a little bit more new person friendly. It's a little less mechanically demanding. In fact, I would argue it's a lot less mechanically demanding, while opening up for more solutions, because generally if you're up on a wall or if you're hanging from something, you don't want to drop bombs on your position. You want to use a projectile like your gun to shoot at enemies nearby. So to me, it just makes sense, similarly to what you would do in, you know, Metroid, Super Metroid Fusion or Zero Mission, where you would be like climbing a ladder or climbing the side of a ladder. Similar situation. There's also there was a couple other things that personally. Oh, the other thing that stood out to me was the story. Like, I don't want to get super detailed into the story because obviously we don't know all the details yet, but we do know a couple of important key details. And to me, these few key details are the most important in terms of why I feel Nintendo is trying to push Metroid into a more consumer-friendly situation. If you're a hardcore Metroid fan, you know what it means whenever I say that they're trying to, or this game is the last in the Metroid v Samus arc. Like, this finishes the story arc that was started in the original Metroid, carried on to Metroid 2, Super Metroid, Metroid Other M, and Fusion. Like, that's... the Metroid Dread is going to finish that arc, not including the Prime games, obviously. If you're not familiar with Metroid, you have no idea what the hell I'm talking about. Other than, like, obviously, oh, these games exist, so the story must be connected in some way, you know. If they finish this arc with this game, they can move on to something else. They can start completely fresh, do something entirely new with Metroid outside of the Metroid Prime games, with the mainline series. That, if they manage to catch new players in, they can start a brand new story arc with Metroid that they don't have to keep, or they don't have to catch new players up on. Like, they want to take Samus down a completely different road, not involving Metroids at all. Like, for example, if they wanted to give the X their own, like the X Parasite, if they want to give the X Parasite their own arc, they could do that. Obviously, you would want to play Fusion first, but they could still give reasons to do that. Or they could do something entirely new. They don't have to do the X Parasite. I doubt they'll do Corruption or the Phase On, because I think they, if I remember right, they wrote that out with Corruption. They could do something entirely new, and they wouldn't have to worry about catching new players up. They'd just be like, all right, hey, we just finished the last arc, the Metroid v Samus arc. Now we're doing a new thing with Samus. If you really wanted to get into Metroid and the Metroid lore and the story, here's the time to do it, because we're moving on after this, you know? So, obviously, new players who play Dread won't get that same, you know, euphoric experience to see the climax to a 30-year-long story. You know, they won't get that same, whoa, like that, like, this is finally how the story ends for Samus against the Metroids. They won't get that same thing, but at least they'll also be able to know that, hey, moving forward, it's all fresh. I don't have to have played the previous games. I can now move on with my own, like, with our own version of Metroid. Like, they can grow up with their own original Metroid. Like, this is our, what Metroid 1 on the NES was to a lot of us, the Metroid after Dread would be to them. And Dread is the one that would be kicking that off more than likely. Which is why I believe, you know, Dread is a game that's trying to bring in a lot of newcomers. And with that, There's also one other design philosophy I wanted to discuss, and I think we're going to end it there. And that is with the Emmy robots. And this is another reason why I'm super excited for Dread. Like I mentioned earlier, Metroid Fusion is one of my favorite Metroid games ever. Like, I enjoy the hell out of that game. I love it every single time I play it. But Metroid Fusion, well, all of the other Metroid games, if you ask any Metroid fan, all of the other Metroid games give you a sense of dread, if you know what I'm talking about, whenever you play it. It basically just means that you are constantly in a sense of isolation. You feel like you're alone the entire time. And that's really great. Like, you never feel like you have help. Everything that you are doing is up to you. If you are in trouble, the only thing you have to rely on is your own skills and your own arsenal at your disposal. That's how Metroid kind of always has been. And Metroid Fusion was the game that took that from an existential sense to a horror sense. Like, it was almost a horror game. If you do hear people talk about Metroid Fusion, they will often compare it to a pseudo horror game. That's because in Metroid Fusion, unlike in any other Metroid game, you were probably your weakest. Like, Samus was the weakest in Fusion starting off than she was in any other game. She was obviously very weak in other games, but she could at least, take a couple of hits before going down, up until you got a couple of energy tanks and stuff, and you could start, tanking your way through shit and demolishing everything your way. Metroid Fusion, even all the way up until the end, you never actually quite reach that point in Metroid Fusion that you do the other games. Once you get to the end of Fusion, yeah, pretty much any of the enemies you originally fought in the beginning, you can demolish, but the thing is, due to how Metroid Fusion's story progresses, a lot of those enemies don't even exist anymore. Like, they're just not there. They've been replaced by stronger versions, or better, or just different, more powerful enemies that you now have to fight. Metroid Fusion never really gets to the point where you feel like an unstoppable deity of destruction. Like, Metroid Fusion never really hits that point. And to me, I feel like that's one of the smartest and coolest things about Metroid Fusion, because the entire game you are hunted by the SAX. I always called it the Saw X growing up, just because I played it as a kid, and it was a lot easier to just say Saw X than SAX. So if I say Saw X, just know that I mean SAX, for you Metroid fans out there. Because you're constantly being hunted by this thing, like, the entire experience of Metroid Fusion is never knowing what to expect whenever you round a corner. Like, if you round a corner, is the Saw X going to be there? Or is it going to kill you? Because it's not a question of could it kill you, it's when will it? Like, you were no match for the Saw X. You messed up anywhere in a situation with the Saw X involved, you were dead. Like, unapologetically, the Saw X straight up murdered you. There was no trickery, illusion, behind the mask situation, mechanically speaking, within the game. Like, if the Saw X was capable of reaching you, it would, and it would kill you. That's how the Saw X was. And you played through the entirety of Metroid Fusion knowing that at any point in time you could potentially run into this thing, and it could just end everything for you. That's what made Fusion feel like a horror game to people. Obviously, if you've played it enough times, and if you played as many times as I have and as other Metroid fans have, you understand that a lot of it is a lot more scripted. There are situations where, as long as you just play it safe, you'll be 100% fine. Like, the second you try to do something like, ooh, look at this, I'm going to try and do something, funny, like, if you try to step out of line, then it would kill you. But as long as you follow the steps that the game clearly tells you to follow, you'd be 100% fine. But the main reason I'm bringing that up is because that appears to be something similar to what they're doing here with the Emmy. Like, the Emmy is very clearly something similar to the Saw X. Like, Samus, obviously I remember watching some of the footage, and Samus in the footage would take a few hits here or there, and she didn't take a whole lot of damage. She took the traditional 10 amount of damage for touch damage and stuff like that. So I don't think in terms of like damage ratios, she is going to be super, super weak or anything. And when it comes to normal enemies, but when it comes to these enemies, obviously they're things you have to avoid. And unlike in Metroid Fusion, where I don't remember the exact numbers, but I think there's only 6 or 7 times when you encounter a Saw X. From what it appears here in Dread, it appears as if these things are just sentries walking around in designated areas. It would be cool if they like explored the sections more. Like if you are aware that there is one in a specific zone, it could be anywhere in that zone and you have to plan accordingly. That would be really, really interesting in terms of gameplay, and it would make you think on your toes a lot more and like force you to spice things up. That would be really interesting. I don't necessarily think they're going to do that. I think to keep things a little bit more player friendly, they're probably going to confine the Emmy to like one sentry area and then have an area of influence that they can chase you around in before you can obviously escape them. If I had to guess, that's just an educated guess by me. They could obviously do their own thing. But there is, and I've seen quite a few people who react to the trailers and the gameplay. There seems to be a general strong consensus that this is heavily inspired by the Saw X. Like, these things will kill you. Unlike the Saw X, where because to give a little context for those who haven't played Metroid Fusion, there are a total of I think 2 or 3 sections where you are forced to actually confront a Saw X, and in all 3 sections you are required to run away. 2 or 3. I think there's only 2. I could be wrong. I want to say only 2. But in those sections where you do have to confront the Saw X, you have no choice but to run away. You have to get as much distance between you and the Saw X as possible, or else it will kill you. And there is absolutely nothing you can do to stop it. There are things you can do to slow it down. Like at some point you unlock ice missiles, and you can use ice missiles to freeze it in place for like 2 seconds, and then it freeze, and then it gets itself free and it chases you again. You can use like some things to slow it down at the least. You can never damage it. You can never actually fight it and damage it, but you can at the very least slow it down. But that does not appear to be the case here. Like, maybe eventually you'll get some things to help ward it off. Obviously there is the suit abilities that allow you to camouflage yourself that they showed off. That's very interesting. But I don't really see them allowing you to fight these things until the very, very end of the game, more than likely. And honestly, I feel like the entire thing is going to end up being very Fusion feeling. Like, if you get into this game and you're playing it and you're like, oh, this kind of feels like Fusion because I'm constantly on the run from these things. Yeah, it's probably because it's going to be very Fusion-esque. That, and I remember watching the Game Explained video on it, and I think they were getting their information from the Treehouse or something else, but supposedly Adam Malkovich is coming back, and if you don't know who that is, he's just an important character. I don't want to spoil too much, just know that he's important. We're not getting the real Adam Malkovich, we are getting an AI version of him. And a lot of people don't like him. I don't mind him at all. Personally, I'm kind of indifferent, but he's coming back, and it appears as if he is going to play a similar role that he did in Fusion, where he's kind of a pseudo guide. Maybe. Obviously, we don't have 100% confirmation on that, but hopefully, well, not hopefully, but it seems as if that we will be getting a situation similar to Fusion in this game, where he'll be like, hey, you should probably move on to this section next, because we need an X thing or whatever from that, or hey, there's an Emmy over here guarding this section, you should probably not go that way or something. So if this game ends up feeling very Fusion-esque whenever you play it, don't be surprised. And to be completely honest, if I were to ask a person, what type of video game experience do you enjoy? Do you enjoy a non-linear one or a linear one? If they tell me a linear one, I navigate them to Fusion. Like, if someone's saying, like, hey, I want to play a Metroid game, but I don't know what I want to get into. Like, I like the platformer. Like, I want to play a platformer one, but I like linear games rather than non-linear. I will direct them directly to Fusion. And then, after that, probably Zero Mission, and then probably Metroid 2. Because Metroid 2 is actually quite a linear game when you think about it. But if they want a non-linear experience, then obviously I would navigate them to Super Metroid, and then probably Zero Mission in Metroid 2 or Metroid 2 Zero Mission, one of the other two. I think at the end of the day, what I was trying to say is I'm almost expecting this game to be very, not exactly Fusion-like. I'm hoping that they do branch off away from Fusion at the end of the day. I hope they do some form of like, exploration situation thing with it. But I just want to say, like, let's just be mindful that this may not be what you want, or maybe it's not what you would expect it to be. If you're expecting Super Metroid, I don't think we're gonna get it. Like, if we do get it, I'll support it. Like, hey, we got another Super Metroid game. Like, Super Metroid is considered one of the best games of all time. Sure, let's go with that. I don't mind that. Personally, I have no preference on which direction that this game goes. I'm just saying, based on what I have seen and can collect based on this information and compile into my brain, I don't think we're going to be getting Super Metroid 2 here. Like, I hate to break it to you, I don't think it's going to happen. We're probably going to get Metroid Fusion 2, more than likely. Or even to, like, make it a little bit better, like Zero Mission 2, because I feel like Zero Mission is a good halfway point between Super Metroid and Metroid Fusion. It's a more of a linear experience, but you're still able to, like, break off the beaten path and do your own kind of thing with it. Like, Zero Mission, I feel like, is actually a really good in-between game between Super Metroid and Fusion. So maybe we'll get something more Zero Mission based, which, if that's the case, I would be, again, 100% for it. No, it doesn't matter to me which direction it goes. If it goes Super Metroid, Fusion, Zero Mission, I don't care. I'm going to buy it. I'm probably going to enjoy it. But all I am going to say is, if we want Metroid to stick around, if we want Nintendo to keep making Metroid games, we have to support it. Like, I hate sounding very consumer-esque, but until the market changes to a point where we can communicate with devs saying, hey, we would greatly appreciate it if you make this game and we'll pay for it, until the market changes in a situation like that, we unfortunately have to speak with our money. And I hate it as much as the next person. I don't like saying, oh, like, if they re-released Metroid Federation Force again, I would hate to buy that game again. I don't want to buy that game again. I didn't necessarily really enjoy it, but I probably still would. Not because I want to, like, support the methods or their selling methods, or their whatever it is that they're trying to put there. Like, oh, we're just trying to make money off of this. Not because I would support that, but because I would support the idea that we need them to understand that Metroid is an interest. Like, Metroid is a company, or is a franchise that will make money. And if they recognize that, they will make more Metroid games. And I think that that's something a lot of people don't seem to grasp. And I don't necessarily blame people who think otherwise, because, like, again, I said I don't like being very consumer, but I feel like a lot of people will go, oh, we can't just throw money at literally everything a company sells at us. And to be fair, they're not wrong, but I think a lot of people say that also don't think about the repercussions of that situation. Like, yeah, we shouldn't just blindly throw money at stuff. I agree, we shouldn't do that. If Metroid Dread comes out and it turns out to be like a glitchy, broken, unfinished pile of code slapped on an SD card and sold at full price, I would say don't buy it. Like, it's not a financially stable game. I'll still buy it, but I wouldn't suggest you buy it, because, I bought Sonic 06 twice. I don't obviously know how to spend my money. But like, the people who say, like, oh, we can't just throw money at things willy-nilly, I don't think they understand that that's how companies talk. Companies don't speak Twitter. They don't speak Reddit. They speak money. And as unfortunate as that is, we have to continue speaking that language until we can change the landscape otherwise. And this video ended up being like over an hour long. I wanted to talk about this for like 20 minutes, and I went on way too many rants. I might end up even just cutting a lot of this out. But that's basically all I had to say. I would like to talk about this more. Like I said, I'm so excited for this game. I'm so excited for Metroid Dread. I love the Metroid series so much. I love seeing Samus come back. I love the suit. I love the art direction. There are so many things I can gush about in terms of Metroid, and I really do like talking about it and discussing it with people. I don't really know a lot of people that likes Metroid though, so I don't have a lot of people to talk about it, which is why I talked for an entire fucking hour. I streamed the 40-minute presentation, and then I continued streaming 2 hours after the presentation, and 90% of that 2 hours was me gushing over Metroid. Like, they talked about Smash Brothers on that direct. They talked about WarioWare, which I'm not super into, but it's still an interesting topic to talk about or discuss. They showed off Breath of the Wild 2. They showed off Breath of the Wild 2, and I was still focused on Metroid, just because of how little Metroid we get. And not only are we getting Metroid Prime 4, but we're getting a new mainline Metroid game. Like, just think about that. Like, just think about it. We're getting a new mainline Metroid title game. In 20 years! This is the first one in 20 years! This is insane! We're not getting just one Metroid game, we're getting two! Of course, the last time that happened, it was Federation Force and Samus Returns, but this is looking a lot better than that. It's a different Prime and 2D combination. Never really realized that correlation until now. That's actually kind of strange. Anyway, I'm super excited about it. I don't know how long this video will end up being, but just know that if we want more Metroid in the future, we have to support this. Like, we have to say, hey, Metroid is a franchise worth investing in. It's all of these games of the past are so amazing. Like, they didn't sell very well, but that's because it's a little bit more niche. You kind of have to, like, understand it a little bit. Once you understand it and you try and get into it, it's one of the best gaming experiences you'll ever have, more than likely. And we have to make that clear. Like, here. If we don't make that clear here and now, we may not see Metroid again for another 20 years. Like, it's just, I hate to say that. I really hate to say that, because I love Metroid. But that could end up being the case. If we don't try and make it loud and clear that, hey, we love Metroid, hey, this is something, like, we want, we will pay you for it, and we will spread it to other people so that way they are familiar with it and they could buy it and pay you money for it, then we can just get more Metroid. We can continue getting another Prime game, a Metroid Prime Trilogy re-release, or eventually to a saga, and maybe a Metroid Saga, Metroid Prime Saga release or something like that, or a original Metroid Saga release, like Metroid Fusion, Samus Returns, Super Metroid Fusion. I said Fusion first. I meant Zero Mission, Samus Returns, Super Metroid Fusion, and then Dread. Like, imagine getting that saga compilation. Like, just imagine that. That would be so amazing. But that will probably never happen. It probably won't, unless we make it clear that that's what we want, that it's worth buying, that it's worth making. And if we don't make that clear, and I'm not talking about it, obviously we could talk about it, I'm not saying you shouldn't talk about it, get on Twitter and discuss it as much as you want, get on Reddit, discuss it as much as you want. That does help. I'm not saying it doesn't. It does help. Discussing it and talking about it, getting it trending, making it more streamlined will help. But until we put our money where our mouth is, our mouth can only do so much, unfortunately. That sounded dirtier than I thought it did. Anyway, I think I'm going to end it off there. Yeah. I know this is probably going to be pretty long. I don't know how much of this I'm going to edit, so it might end up being pretty long. If you want more discussion videos like this, let me know. I will gladly make more Metroid videos. I'd love talking about Metroid. I would love to talk about Zelda. I would love to talk about Mario, Kirby, Pokemon, Sonic, Donkey Kong. Like, I love talking about things for, like, just a long period of time. But the main problem is I don't have I'm not very good at editing, and I don't find editing all that fun. So until I can get someone to edit them for me, they're probably just going to be these really long-winded videos, unfortunately. But until then, I hope that you did stay into the end. I'm glad that this is happening. I hope that you guys are as excited as I am. And until next time, I will see you all then.